Hello, and welcome to the 20th Annual Filipov Peace and Justice Forum. I'm Elizabeth Half, Chairman of the Planning Committee for the Forum. The Forum was created to remember the life of Al Filipov, a beloved member of Trinitarian Congregational Church in Concord, who was killed in the terrorist attack of 9/11 at the World Trade Center. Trained as an engineer, Al was a wonderful husband and father, a human rights activist, a painter, an inventor, a sailor, and he loved a good story. Al cared deeply about the world in all of its pain and its beauty, and he always brought out the best in people. He also believed in the potential of an individual to really make a positive difference in the world. After 9/11, in the face of tremendous personal loss and national tragedy, the family and friends of Al Filipov tried to craft a response that went beyond the instinctive desire for revenge. The idea of a living memorial, focused on the values of peace and justice that were so dear to Al's heart, led to the founding of the Filipov Forum in 2002. Each September for the past 19 years, we've invited individuals who have worked for peace and justice to come to Concord and speak about their work. We have honored people from a variety of backgrounds and faith traditions, some famous, some working very much behind the scenes, but all committed to a life of actively engaged for peace and justice. This year, we are very pleased to honor September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, who will be represented by Colleen Kelly and Leila Murphy. Following an introduction and remembrances by Loretta Filipov, Colleen and Leila will speak live, and we invite you, please, if you have any questions, to post them in the chat box, and we will answer them as best we can in the time remaining after the presentations. The forum's goals are simple but not easy. Recalling a day, remembering a life, changing the world. Today, we recall the events of 9/11. We remember the life of Al Filipov, and we look to our honorees to inspire us to try to make the world a better place. So thank you so much for joining us today, and it's my privilege to present Loretta Filipov, Al's widow, and the guiding light of the forum.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Liz. Thank you for the wonderful introduction and the very, very kind words about Al. Changing the world. This is so apropos because that's what I think of when I think of peaceful tomorrows. A man in our church community, and we've been here a long, long time, so those of you that have a long-term attendance, 60 years or so like me, you may remember Dick Nethercutt, a wonderful, wonderful man of God who pushed everybody to go beyond what they could do. He showed me a picture of a woman who had gone to Afghanistan. She was for Peaceful Tomorrows, Rita Lazar. She and 5 other members of a newly formed group went to Afghanistan to tell the people they were very, very sorry for what our airplanes and militia had done, and it's not the way our loved ones would want to be remembered, with killing other people. I looked them up, I phoned some people, and the rest is history. I joined the group, and I have to say that in many, many ways, along with this community, my friends here, Peaceful Tomorrows saved me. They gave me a voice, and indeed we did try, and still are trying to change the world. So, dear, dear friends, all my best friends that I never wanted to know, on behalf of the Filipov family and the Peace and Justice Forum, I present you with this award. Go forth and make peace.
Wow, thank you so much, Loretta. Thank you to Liz and Richard and to everybody at the Trinitarian Congregational Church. in Concord, Massachusetts. This is incredibly meaningful to our organization and also personally. I didn't know Al, but I love Al through Loretta, and thank you so much for the award. My name is Colleen Kelly, and I'm one of the co-founders of September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. My brother, Bill Kelly Jr., was killed on September 11th at the Trade Centers.
Thanks, Colleen. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful introduction. And also, though I didn't know Al, have really enjoyed getting to know Loretta through Peaceful Tomorrows, and I'm very grateful to accept this on behalf of the organization. My name is Leila Murphy. I am one of the younger members, and I feel very grateful to have found Peaceful Tomorrows, and similarly, the friends I didn't necessarily want to know, and I'm so grateful to have made. And my father, Brian Murphy, worked in the World Trade Center and was killed on 9/11.
So we wanted to start off today as members of September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, talking about not so much 9/11 itself and that day, we all remember that day, but we really wanted to talk about September 12th and beyond September 12th, because truly the heart and soul and mind of Peaceful Tomorrows lies in the what's happening next, and what we both as individuals and as an organization chose in our response to the tragedies that became a part of our lives. So I'll start briefly, I hope, with a history of Peaceful Tomorrows and some of the work that we do. And then Leila will also speak about some of the more recent activities. You may all remember, or not, that 3 days after September 11th, on September 14th of 2001, the US Congress passed what's called the Authorization to Use Military Force. And that was the official, or what became to be the official response to 9/11 within the United States. Personally, it was still a very tragic time, and it was very shocking, and I don't remember that, but I would assume that many people do. That 3 days later has led to 20 years now of war and kind of unending conflict and unending armed conflict. That authorization to use military force still exists in the US Congress. It has not been repealed, and we'll talk about this later. It is one of the things that Peaceful Tomorrows works on, but it's somewhat telling that to this day, 20 years later, it's still part of who we are as a nation and part of our national response. Less than a month later, on October 7th of 2001, that's when the United States and coalition forces began the bombing campaign in Afghanistan. I remember that day very well. I was with my mother and father on that day, and it felt really bad in many of the ways that September 11th felt really bad, knowing that now there are going to be families on the other side of the world that would be experiencing similar tragedy and similar loss to my family. And from a very visceral level, it didn't seem to make sense. It didn't seem to be right to cause loss in other people that had nothing to do with September 11th. And so that was the beginning of trying to reconcile a national response, personally for me, that wasn't making sense. That led to November of 2001, when friends of mine told me that the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops would be meeting for their annual meeting down in Washington, D.C. And I wrote a letter to the bishops, basically saying that I didn't understand the U.S. response. And as a Catholic, please help me understand this, and please help me understand why our nation was choosing war. As most of you know, the Catholic Conference of Bishops voted to fully support the war, except for the 200 and some bishops voted against it. But because of that, these same friends told me that there was a group of other 9/11 family members that were on a walk for healing and peace that had started at the Pentagon, and they were literally walking from the Pentagon to New York City to Ground Zero. And that really was fascinating information because it was the first time I had heard of other family members that were interested in some other way, some other response. So we ended up meeting when this group of walkers, and these walkers included people from the peace movement, they included people from Kathy Kelly's, what was then called Voices in the Wilderness. They ended up here in early December, and we met that night at St. Francis Xavier in Manhattan and had a forum to discuss issues that were vivid and alive and what was really happening. And after that forum, we went out to a bar, a famous bar in New York City called the White Horse Tavern, where famous poets and writers have sat and written great things for years. And on a bar napkin, we sat down and wrote what we thought as a group of family members, what we would like a response to look like. And as people who were directly affected, how we could imaginatively think of a different way, a different response. So in a dark, crowded bar in New York City in a cold December night, that's where Peaceful Tomorrows was born, on a bar napkin. But we started hearing also about other family members. Rita Lasar, a woman who lived in the Lower East Side, she had been very vocal, and Loretta mentioned Rita, that she had been on talk shows. We had heard about Phyllis and Orlando Rodriguez, a couple who had lost their son Greg, who had also had works published about questioning the US official response. So all these family members were beginning to be connected. And in January of 2002, and again, Loretta referenced this trip, 4 family members, including Rita, decided to travel to Afghanistan to meet with Afghan families who had also been affected by armed conflict, and really who had, they were civilians, just like our family members were, who were caught in this web of violence. We like to say that trip to Afghanistan was really the heart of Peaceful Tomorrows, both literally and figuratively. I gave Rita a very small brass heart that she took with her on the trip and buried in the dirt in Afghanistan. So quite literally, our hearts are living with the people of Afghanistan since January of 2002. In February of that year, we launched formally as an organization at the United Nations Church Center. And that's kind of the more cognitive part of our group. We became an organization, we became an NGO. And with that, formal acknowledgement of our work and what we are attempting to do. I want to spend 1 minute reading of our goals, which we formally announced when we launched, because I feel like I had kind of forgotten about these goals, or they got pushed to the back. And rereading them this past month with the 20th anniversary, they seem just incredibly prescient. And these goals came from what was written down on that bar napkin in the White Horse Tavern. So bear with me. There's 7 short goals. Number 1, to promote dialogue on alternatives to war while educating and raising the consciousness of the public on issues of war, peace, and the underlying causes of terrorism. Number 2, to support and offer fellowship to others seeking nonviolent response to all forms of terrorism, both individual and institutional. To call attention to threats to civil liberties, human rights, and other freedoms in the US as a consequence of war. Number 4, to acknowledge our fellowship with all the people affected by violence and war, recognizing that the resulting deaths are overwhelmingly civilian. 5, to encourage the multilateral, collaborative effort to bring those responsible for September 11th attacks to justice in accordance with principles of international law. Number 6, to promote US foreign policy that places a priority on internationally recognized principles of human rights, democracy, and self-rule. And lastly, to demand an ongoing investigation into the events leading up to September 11th, 2001, that took the lives of our loved ones, including an exhaustive examination of US foreign policies and national security failures. So looking back at these goals, they're all still relevant today. One of those goals mentioned acknowledging fellowship with other people affected by terrorism. And in March and April of 2002, two groups formally reached out to us, Peaceful Tomorrows, and asked if they could come and visit and both pay their respects at Ground Zero, but talk and kind of share our commonalities. The first group to do that was a group called the Parent Circle, which is a group of parents of both Israeli and Palestinian parents who have lost children to the violence in the Middle East. And the second group to do so was the Habakasha, the atomic bomb survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Parent Circle came and they set up a coffin exhibit in front of the United Nations as a way to symbolize the death of people who had died to violence. The Habakasha, who were just lovely and asked if they could visit Ground Zero. They brought us a seedling of a tree, of a shrub that had survived the atomic blast, which was back then was nearly 60 or 70. I guess this was 2002, so it was many, many years after the atomic blast of 1945, and they wanted to plant that tree at Ground Zero. And unfortunately, because of many things, but mostly, priorities had kind of set in then, a very orchestrated and hierarchical understanding of who could visit Ground Zero and who could not. We were not permitted to bring Habakasha to Ground Zero, but instead we're allowed through Trinity Church down there to instead be on the perimeter. And I'll get back to the story about the shrub. It's important for later on. As that year unfolded, everyone may remember there was no mistaking the winds of war that were now swirling around, and it became very apparent the United States was beginning to direct its attention towards Iraq very quickly after we kind of somewhat declared a victory in Afghanistan. It was now all orchestrated to turn attention to Iraq. And Peaceful Tomorrows, kind of our first big lobbying efforts, were to both head to Washington, D.C. and lobby on behalf of civilians who were killed in Afghanistan and a type of a civilian compensation fund for Afghan families. And then the second big lobbying effort was really to stop, as kind of naive as that may sound, stop and prevent a war in Iraq. We sent a delegation to Iraq in January of 2003, less than 2 months prior to the beginning of that war, again, to meet with civilians that we know would be harmed, because the overwhelming number of people who are harmed in war are civilian. Unfortunately, those efforts failed, and that was a very big blow to not just Peaceful Tomorrows, but everyone working for peace and justice around the world. Around the world, there were February 15th protests around the world trying to stop that war. But we didn't give up. Again, we led an effort called Stonewalk through that was spearheaded by a group at the Peace Abbey, Louis Ronda at the Peace Abbey. Loretta's good friends with Louis. And Stonewalk was an effort in 2004 to push a stone, a 2,000-pound stone, headstone really, that is marked to the unknown civilian killed in war. And we walked that stone on a caisson from Boston to New York City in time for the third, what would have been the third anniversary in 2004 of 9/11. And it was really to call attention in every town and place that we walk through. Of course, you have this massive caisson and stone. People would say, "What's that? What are you doing?" It was really to call attention to the issues of civilian casualties, which was so important to our group. For the 5th anniversary of September 11th, we held an international conference for people who had been affected directly by violence and war around the world. It included Habakasha, it included the Parent Circle, but we brought also people from Northern Ireland, from Argentina, from from the bombing blasts in Great Britain that had happened, from the bombings that had happened in Russia, from Mumbai, from the Indonesia and Bali blasts. We brought people together to New York City again to call attention to the very, very real issue of civilian harm, and to try to work together to stop this. All the while, our membership was growing. People like Bruce Wallace, who set up a Baghdad to Brooklyn group. He had students in Brooklyn who were emailing and talking to students in Baghdad. And so teenagers from different parts of the world were really talking about what it's like in their lives and their hopes and dreams for the future, and realizing the commonality that we all have. We have members like Talat Hamdani, whose son was kind of obliquely accused of being related to 9/11, and whereas the real truth was that her son was at ground zero and helping people. Talat is a Muslim Pakistani woman, and her son died helping others, and kind of she had this double loss, first of her son himself, and then also the loss of her son's reputation, which she worked really hard to regain and call attention to the discrimination that was happening against Muslim Americans and Muslims in this country and around the world. And then lastly, and then I'm going to hand it over to Leila, probably in the later 2009, 2010, we started with the Rule of Law initiative. And that was really because there became to be this understanding organizationally that now 8 and 9 years had passed, and still there still was no accountability despite having a commission. There was still no real accountability for September 11th. And we wanted to know not only what happened, but the who, when, how, and why. And we wanted justice. We wanted a justice in a true sense that didn't harm other people, but does bring to justice the people who were responsible for the crimes of September 11th. So I'm going to hand this over to Leila, and you'll hear more about our more recent work.
Thank you, Colleen. I could hear Colleen talk forever, and it still gives me chills to hear about just the founding of Peaceful Tomorrows, particularly because I did not find out about it until much later, and a lot of the work wasn't as publicized, or it wasn't as known. So I feel so grateful to have found Peaceful Tomorrows, and always love hearing about the history. But I'll just give my own kind of story with 9/11. So on 9/11, I do not remember the events of 9/11. I was 3 years old at the time, and my father was killed. And it's a very different experience coming of age with this knowledge, coming of age with the world that 9/11 created. And I have just, as I grew up, this was something that was just always a part of me. It was a part of my identity, and it was not always a part of my identity that I wanted to draw attention to. It felt like a singling out. And then as I got older, I started to become engaged with politics, and I started to develop my own beliefs. And I felt more and more that there wasn't really a place in the 9/11 victim community for me, since what I saw in the media was that victimhood was it was associated with revenge, with pushing for more war, pushing for more revenge for, the loss that a lot of victims had felt. So that, I would say, accentuated my not really feeling at home in the victim community and not wanting to identify with this part. When I was in college, I started to study more politics and the history of the Middle East and the history of American intervention. And I became more aware than I had been of the need, for people like me to really speak out against the atrocities, against the injustice that we'd seen. But I still didn't really have a voice, or didn't have a way to process that. And my junior year of college, my sister sent me an article that was titled "How Guantanamo is Delaying Justice for 9/11 Family Members." And so I had, heard of Guantanamo, but only in the sense of we should close Guantanamo, and acknowledging that a lot of that Guantanamo, the laws there did not follow by international principles, and the lack of justice, but I hadn't really thought about it in the, I wasn't even aware of the trials going on, which I think is a purposeful effort since it's held in Cuba to shield people from the knowledge and there's a lack of transparency. But anyways, I hadn't heard about that, but my sister sent me this article, and I was fascinated, immediately wanted to know more. And I reached out to the author, Julia Rodriguez, who is the daughter of Phyllis and Orlando, who you have heard about before. And Julia was immediately willing to talk. We got on the phone, and it was just, that was the first experience I really had of how powerful it can be and how there's this instant connection between people who have experienced very similar losses and in similar ways have struggled with finding a place in the 9/11 victim narrative and the idea of what victims should be. And Julia was so kind and willing to talk. And it also turned out that Greg, her brother, had worked at the same place, like in both worked in Eastmead, like at Cantor Fitzgerald. And so that was also a very special connection to share. And since then, so after my conversation with Julia, my sister and I both wanted to get involved. And so the first thing we did, we entered the lottery to travel to Guantanamo. And I do remember before we went, we met with Phyllis and Orlando, which was another like beautiful connection moment, and also just very helpful for preparing us and helping us think about it. And Guantanamo was it was emotionally and politically challenging experience, and a lot to process. And coming back from that, I really felt so grateful to have met people through Peaceful Tomorrows that I could talk to, that I could discuss with what I experienced and how I felt that my victimhood was being used in ways to justify pain and to justify further abuse that I felt uncomfortable with. So Peaceful Tomorrows not only gave me, a community I could process that with, but also a place, a means to actually use my voice and do something about it. The first action of Peaceful Tomorrows I was involved in was my sister. After we returned, we spoke at the annual rally to close Guantanamo, which happens every January and will happen until Guantanamo is closed. So hopefully not next year, but we'll see. But that was really powerful, and it was a very emotionally powerful moment for me as well, since I was really claiming this, identity. I hadn't really felt comfortable with the 9/11 victim label, and it still sometimes, felt strange bringing this up again. But it felt like something like this time I had a purpose, and I felt like I really supported the views of Peaceful Tomorrows and the people I'd met, and really felt passionately about the cause. And then through that, I also, in the spring, I met Colleen for the first time, and we lobbied. One of the first lobbying actions I was involved with was lobbying for the medical exemption to Guantanamo, being able to transfer detainees to the United States to get medical care, since Peaceful Tomorrows has wanted the detainees to be transferred and the trials to be transferred and for Guantanamo to be closed. And that was very powerful too. I'd never experienced, this was back when lobbying was actually knocking on people's doors in person those days. But that was really powerful as well, realizing my voice, not only as the daughter of a 9/11 victim, but also as a citizen, as a United States citizen, who wanted to be aware of where my tax dollars were going, and of what policies, were invoked in my name. And so since then, Colleen touched a bit on the rule of law work. So I got most involved in the beginning with the Guantanamo Committee, so doing work around closing Guantanamo, and I got to meet some great organizations and people to collaborate with, from the ACLU, Human Rights First, Centers for Victims on Torture, which was also a great experience to just know that there are these advocates who have been working so tirelessly, like everyone in Peaceful Tomorrows, since the very beginning. And that was really inspiring to me as someone, you know, coming of age in my generation, just having models of people who had really not just, you know, signaled, not just said what they thought, but had really, you know, year after year had advocated for these policies and stood up for what they believed in, was really inspiring to me, and a great experience. So we also, Peaceful Tomorrows, as Colleen mentioned, the AUMFs were the authorizations for military force passed right after 9/11. And we've also gotten involved, in addition to our work with Guantanamo, with working with a coalition of groups to repeal the AUMF. And I have been able, particularly in the past year, to work on that committee, work in collaboration with others. We've spoken to representatives of Senator Schumer's office. We've spoken to different representatives who have spoken against, in favor of repealing the AUMFs. And the jury's still out. We're still working on that, still focusing on getting to our representatives. But the 2002 AUMF repeal did pass through the House, which is a sea change from the beginning. And even, you know, it's very inspiring to me, even in the time I've been working with Peaceful Tomorrows, seeing how the consensus, even though very slowly, is starting to shift more toward the realization that endless war cannot be the answer. So that's been inspiring as well, and an important, you know, lesson that hard work does lead to some things. And this past year in particular has been really meaningful with Peaceful Tomorrows. Since we've been very active, the Rule of Law Committee decided to establish, Colleen and Terry had established, Colleen and Terry really have been, you know, carrying the Rule of Law Committee on their backs and doing all of this work for so long.
With a lot of others.
with a lot of others. Everyone in Peaceful Tomorrows, really. But they decided to, you know, my sister and I had joined, and another member, Elizabeth Miller, who also lost her father on 9/11, joined Peaceful Tomorrows, and we all wanted to get involved and wanted to be engaged. And Colleen and Terry helped establish the Rule of Law Fellows Program. So my sister and Liz and myself all worked throughout from the spring to now, working, since there were a lot of activities and mobilization efforts around the 20th commemoration. So through that, you know, we have released policy statements on Guantanamo and on the authorizations for military force. We've gotten PT more of a voice in terms of our policies and advocating to representatives. We are still working, meeting with the White House, meeting with people to get our voice known and to finally have Guantanamo closed. It's also been, you know, a lot of the work of lobbying, of advocacy it's not glamorous work. It's the emails, it's the meetings, it's the trying to get your voice across. And I just am, what keeps me going is knowing that everyone in Peaceful Tomorrows has been doing this for so long. And, you know, a lot of, as Colleen said, there's been roadblocks along the way. There's been policies that haven't exactly gone your way. But it's just so inspiring to see how people keep going and keep fighting for justice, and fighting for justice through peace. And that really just keeps me going, and keeps me so grateful to be a part of this community. So that is all I have to say.
I'm sorry.
That's all I have to say, but I just am very happy to be here with Colleen, to be here in memory of Al, who just seems like a wonderful person that I wish I had gotten to meet, and to be here with all of you. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Though I think Colleen has been here through it all, so she knows.
I just have one last follow-up. I mentioned the seedling tree that Habakasha brought to us in April of 2002. And I didn't quite know what to do with this tree, and ended up bringing it to the New York City Parks Department. Has a nursery and greenhouses in Woodlawn in the Bronx. So I brought it one day to the greenhouse out of the blue, and whoever was working there, I just told them a little bit about the story and said, really, someday we'd love to have this planted down at ground zero, but until then it needs nurturing and care. Could you all please take care of it? And I wasn't quite sure if they thought, I don't know what they thought, because I didn't have any credentials. I didn't have a business card. I didn't have anything. I just had a story. So last week, a friend of mine who works in the Parks Department, I asked him if he had ever been to the Woodlawn greenhouse and he knew anything about a tree that from the hibakusha from people in Japan. And he said, oh yeah, it's there. It's in a massive 4-foot planted planter and it's growing fine. It's there if you want to go see it. So that was kind of the best thing to happen this 20th anniversary, to think that this seedling from people who experienced really the original ground zero in Japan, in Hiroshima, who had brought this seedling to Peaceful Tomorrows, to the second ground zero, and that this seedling exists and it's grown and it's flourished through nurture and care of strangers. And that's really kind of, I guess, not to sound too hokey, but the hope of Peaceful Tomorrows, that we all nurture each other and we nurture the work that we do, and we push forward through persevere. So thank you. Thanks to you, Loretta. Thanks, Al, and thanks to Concord, Mass.
And thank you to you both. It's Liz Haff speaking to you now. We really appreciate your wonderful and beautiful words and your inspiration. We have a few questions that have come into the chat box, and I'll just read through them pretty much in the order in which they've come in. And the first one is just a request from Terry Green. She wondered if you might mention Gloria and Robin's symposia in Harlem, connecting safety in our communities to the need to address racism, Islamophobia, and gun violence.
Yeah, that I don't know the exact year that happened, but thank you, Terry Green, for mentioning that. Robin and Gloria worked really, really hard to make those connections, make firm connections between what was happening to peoples of color around the world in the bombing campaigns that the U.S. was part of, that same type of discriminatory policies and practices and violence was happening right here at home. So thanks to Robin and Gloria for all their really, really hard work, making those connections very early on. This wasn't just last year. It was very, very early on, and lots of time and effort to both the international work, but really what was happening here too.
The questioner mentioned that in 2019 on Martin Luther King Day, We Are One was the last one that was held.
Thanks, Terry.
Yeah. And then we have a question. Most of the 9/11 terrorists had entered the USA from Saudi Arabia. Has there been any reaching out to young men of Saudi Arabia?
Well, yes, that is correct. 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. We've never formally reached out to the kingdom. I'm sure people have read in the news that there are certain family members who were part of a suit against the kingdom to try to obtain more information about potential involvement, but we have not directly worked with young men from Saudi Arabia. Sorry to say, but that's a really, really interesting idea. So thank you to whoever wrote that question in.
And this is just a remark, but I wanted to share it with you. Ellen Quackenbush has written, "This is so powerful as a statement of choice in life. My hometown in New Jersey suffered many deaths of parents in the Twin Towers, with teachers overwhelmed with children dealing with PTSD of the families and children. It's so right to choose reconciliation, but it's a very difficult choice in the face of personal loss." So I just wanted to mention that. And I think many of us have felt that way. Now, let's see, let me scroll further down here. Bear with me a moment. Here's another comment. Thank you, as this is most informative. And as AJ, most radical pacifist, once said, there's no way to peace. peace is the way. And thanks for all of the work for peace that you do. I wonder if you work with organizations like Veterans for Peace. You and they, in different ways, have direct personal experience with violence.
Yes, many, many times. Veteran for Peace, they're an amazing organization, particularly early on when there was a lot of work in rallies here in New York City and around the country against both what was happening in Afghanistan in the fall of 2001, but also working hard with Veterans for Peace to prevent the war in Iraq. And then, but even today, our work continues with veterans. The ending of combat troops in Afghanistan was awful for everyone in so many ways, and we really feel for our veteran brothers and sisters who have a lot of feelings about that, and they're certainly the experts about what their life was like in the military. But the vets do great work. Like, when I was in Iraq, we saw projects that Veterans for Peace had come and built water filtration plants in Iraq from what had happened in Iraq in 1992. So they're an amazing organization.
Yeah, and I feel lucky. I've also gotten to work with Veterans for Peace and with other veteran organizations in the work to repeal the authorizations for military force, which has been very personally meaningful for me as well, and just am always, amazed by their advocacy.
And there's another question. Is Peaceful Tomorrows doing lobbying to cut the defense budget, the NDAA? I believe Representative Lee and a few others have an amendment to cut the Pentagon budget by 10% so that money may be reused for life-affirming projects.
So I just saw there was a quick little note there from Ellen Barfield from Veterans for Peace. So hi, Ellen, because we have worked in the past together, and there you have it. So about the NDAA, we work within a coalition. It's called the Human Rights and Security Coalition, and the NDA comes out, or it all starts really late spring, early summer, about where the money's all going to. So we work really hard with a lot of other groups who are mostly based in DC about not only where money is going to, but also about anything that pertains to Guantanamo that has been part of the NDAA. And really the transfers from Guantanamo of any of the detainees have been prohibited, the funding for transfers since 2012. So yes, there's some groups who take the lead on that, but we are part of a coalition. So the groups like the ACLU, Center for Constitutional Rights, Human Rights First, Human Rights Watch, big organizations that are powerhouses in this work. And we're very lucky that they teach us so much.
And here's a question. Can you say more about the Rule of Law program or activities?
Sure. Yeah. So the Rule of Law is, as the name suggests, the committee does work to restore rule of law, but law meaning, behaviors in conformance with international principles of justice and of fairness. And the Rule of Law Committee, since the very beginning of the commissions at Guantanamo, which have gone through a long history, we won't get into here, but the commissions in the beginning were really just rounding up, during the war in Afghanistan, a lot of people were rounded up and brought to Guantanamo who really had no connection to 9/11 or to the events, and really no reason of being there. And the creation of Guantanamo was really for being able to be kind of outside of those standards of law and the rule of law and justice. And so Peaceful Tomorrows, since the beginning of the military commission, so the trials to bring to justice the people associated with planning the 9/11 attacks, since the very beginning, Peaceful Tomorrows has sent a representative there. There are NGOs who have the ability to, send one member, and Peaceful Tomorrows, since it has gotten NGO status and since the beginning, has sent someone. So we have really been there as an organization, not me personally, since I was a child for a lot of it, but Peaceful Tomorrows as an organization has been watching these commissions really since the very beginning. So the work with Guantanamo is really a big focus of the committee's work in terms of observing what's happening in the trials, observing the ways in which the rule of law is not being followed, observing the ways in which the government, in an effort to not come clear with all of the information about torture and about the post 9/11 response, has been on the side of secrecy and of hiding rather than holding trials openly. So the commissions are still the 9/11 commissions, so the commissions that are trying the 5 men accused of planning the attacks are still in pretrial hearings, have made very little progress. Peaceful Tomorrows has been there through all of these pretrial hearings as we try to sort out something that kind of shouldn't be there in the first place. So Peaceful Tomorrows focuses our energy on closing Guantanamo, bringing the commissions, and bringing the people who have been accused, bringing people to justice, but in conformance with the principles of international law and not in the circus happening now at Guantanamo, unfortunately. So there's another, that's kind of an overview of the rule of law. I will say I just started law school, and it is inspiring for me too. And I've already learned a lot through working on. I also saw another question actually about Peaceful Tomorrow's amicus brief, which you can speak more, but I'm happy to also. We were lucky enough with, through the different human rights groups we work, to be able to submit a brief in the case of Abu Zubaydah, who was one of the first to be waterboarded and tortured, and whose torture was revealed in kind of excruciating detail. And basically our position has always been, we need more transparency, we need declassification of information related to torture, since often it's rather than it's under the guise of national security, but often is more preventing national embarrassment for the practices we engaged in as a country. And so I really believe in the rule of law work. For me is really more about recognizing my own role as a US citizen and as a person in this world, and trying to act for the principles that I believe in, and that our country has sadly not held up to.
And it's important. Forums like this, we thank Loretta and everyone there, are really important because we take our job as observers really seriously. It's so difficult to know what's happening at Guantanamo that one of the few ways that the public has information, besides Carol Rosenberg at the New York Times, is when observers go and get to look and watch firsthand at these pretrial hearings, and then come back to the States. And it's really our job to spread the word about the lack of transparency, about what's happening in our names, as for those of us who are United States citizens. So that was a great overview. Thanks, Leila. But it's kind of, it's a really important part of our work because it's out of sight and out of mind for real reasons, for real purpose. And we feel like it's our job to kind of break through that opaqueness and shine some light on what's really happening.
Thank you. And we have another question for Leila. What are your thoughts about your continued work with Peaceful Tomorrows and in making it relevant to youth?
That's a good question. I think I saw Phyllis ask that. Hi, Phyllis. What are my thoughts? So, I mean, as I said, I think it's really inspiring. The most inspiring thing for me about Peaceful Tomorrows, aside from the, just bond and friendship I have with people in it, has been seeing people who have advocated for their beliefs and what they stand stand for long before 9/11 and in all of the years since. And I think in my generation, I feel like that's an important lesson for us to learn, that activism is not just about signaling on social media. It's not just about the outward signs of activism and of knowing people are activists, but it's really about just the actions you do every day, how you treat the people in your life, how you act in your community, how you think about your role as a citizen of wherever you're a part of. So that's been really meaningful to me, and I think there are a lot of lessons, and I think a lot of Peaceful Tomorrows is a lot of work left to be done, unfortunately. And so there's still a lot of work we have to do. And I think also my generation has become more aware of the links between militarism and the militarization of policies, the expansion of the defense budget, all of these things as related to the other crises we're facing today, as related to racism, and seeing Gloria and Robin's work from the very beginning, making those connections. And also related to what's happening with the climate and the crisis there. So I think my generation has been more, open. There's an openness in the discourse now to seeing the links between all of these systems. And I feel very grateful again to be part of an organization that has really known that since the beginning and really seen the connections. Yeah, so that's a bit, but there's lots more to be done is the short of it. And I feel grateful to work with Colleen. And
this is why we're so hopeful, because of the youth, because of young people.
Wonderful. Another question, what legislators have been most supportive of your work so that we can thank them and push them for continued advocacy?
Barbara.
Oh, Barbara Lee, number one.
Yeah.
Rokahana.
Yeah.
It depends. I would say overall, it's hard to say overall who's really, really supportive, because oftentimes legislation or there's pieces where we're in agreement, but then other things that we're not so much in agreement. So that gets a little bit tricky, but overall, Barbara Lee wins the prize.
Yeah.
Everyone, I'm from New York, so it depends on what the issue is, honestly. But I guess that's part of why we're so grateful to be part of a larger coalition that has such a presence in DC, because they know the staff people of congresspersons, and that's really, really helpful to kind of not just meet with staff people, to either senator or representative, and understand their positions, but really work with the staff towards whatever it is that, whatever issue that we're really working on. There was, as far as Guantanamo, there was a letter by 40 some senators about their concerns and the reasons why Guantanamo needs to be closed and why there needs to be a change of direction and policy at Guantanamo. So if I was really good, we could figure out a way to put that in the chat, but I can't.
Yeah. And also just a small thing to add. So as part of the effort to repeal the authorization for military force, we work with a bipartisan coalition, and there actually has been a lot of bipartisan support for repealing these authorizations and finally ending the forever wars. So that's been heartwarming, and things don't always fall under strict lines, and as Colleen said, it's always shifting, so always room for more, encouraging more.
It's shifting too, because especially in the House of Representatives, someone who might be around, I'm thinking of Dennis Kucinich, who was super, super helpful to us in lobbying against the war in Iraq, and in fact let us camp out in his office while we were doing our work. He's no longer a congressperson, so it gets a little tricky with representatives in particular, because their time can be so short, 2 years, and that it's and different staffing positions and committee chairs and committee memberships.
Thanks. I just wanted to bring up also in the chat box, someone has written that you should actively explore the work of A/E, I assume that's architects and engineers, for 9/11 truth. Several thousand engineers and architects are very actively working on this issue. Have you all heard of that group?
Yes, and there's some cross-pollination. There are members of our group that are very interested in the issues similar to what the architects and engineers are interested in. So I think it's kind of, there's people who straddle very different worlds. You know, there's 9/11 family groups, for instance, that worked on skyscraper safety, but who also might be part of another group. So there's definitely members of our group that are interested in those issues. I don't know if you can become a member of architects and engineers for 9/11 truth unless you're an architect or engineer. But Bob McElvain comes to mind, and he's very public about his work for 9/11 truth. Our work for Peaceful Tomorrows is, you know, I read those goals, the 7 goals at the beginning, and one of those goals is really about an exhaustive investigation to what really happened on September 11th. And honestly, because there has been no trial of the 9/11 accused, we have not seen the evidence presented against the accused in any public forum. And the commission's kind of chipped away in some small way, the 9/11 commissions, but it didn't really get to the larger heart of how this all happened. And that's, in order to have a healing and reconciliation, you know, you have to have accountability. So we're still looking for that accountability, both individually and organizationally.
Thank you. There is a question also. How do you see Peaceful Tomorrows working for Afghans at this point?
That's a very, very difficult question. But I'm glad it was asked for 2 reasons. One, we do have an Afghanistan committee that is an amazing group of people, including Ellen Judd and Kelly Campbell and Andrea LeBlanc, who've done incredible work throughout the years. Kelly was one of the delegation that first went. It's from what the brief understanding I have of what their work is now, that it's very difficult for safety issues, and people that our organization has worked with. There's many issues of safety that exist in Afghanistan. So I don't feel like I could publicly comment on that, except that our hearts were buried in Afghanistan, figuratively, back in 2002, and they're still there. There's a lot of compassion towards the Afghan people, and the great deal of suffering that they've endured for literally 20 years and more, decades.
Thank you. I just want to point out something in the chat box, which is pretty wonderful. There was an article that someone found about the bombing surviving trees that are referenced by so many. And the name of the article is "Life Always Wins, Follow Me." A botanist is introduced to escapees from the atomic bomb in Hiroshima by Stefano Mancuso, and it was July 28th, 2021. And also in the chat box, we're reminded that you can learn a lot about the stories about Peaceful Tomorrows and their work at their website, which is www.peacefultomorrows.org. And it includes educational resources and ongoing work in Afghanistan, and about Guantanamo and people who travel there to bear witness. So I think, and also you have done such a wonderful job, and the chat is full of people thanking you for your work. And I will add my thanks to that, Colleen Kelly and Leila Murphy. We've been so moved and inspired by your words and your work and vision. Thank you. On behalf of Loretta Filipov, the Filipov family, and the Al Filipov Peace and Justice Forum, we commend the work of September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. And we urge everyone, wherever you may be hearing this program, to be a catalyst for Peaceful Tomorrows. Thank you both so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Loretta. Thank you.